The
9,161st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Germany, Greece, Poland, Slovakia, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Ms. Denise Brown, United Nations resident and humanitarian coordinator in Ukraine. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, the situation for civilians in Ukraine remains dire. As of 18 October, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 15,956 civilian casualties, 6,322 killed, and 9,634 injured since 24 February 2022. At least 397 children have been killed in the war since 24 February. The actual figures are likely considerably higher. In a recent and concerning development, the Russian Federation launched a series of attacks against cities and towns across the country. On the morning of 10 October, Russian armed forces reportedly launched missiles and drones, killing at least 20 civilians and injuring over 100, including in Kyiv, Dnipro, and Zaporizhia. Many civilian objects, including dozens of residential buildings and physical infrastructure, were damaged. In total, between 10 and 18 October, at least 38 Ukrainian civilians reportedly killed and at least 117 injured by missile and drone attacks. In addition to immediate loss of life, the United Nations is gravely concerned about the destruction of critical energy infrastructure, such as power plants. According to the Ukrainian government, 10% of energy facilities have been hit since 10 October. Combined with soaring gas and coal prices, the devastation caused by these attacks threatens to expose millions of civilians to extreme hardship and even life-endangering conditions this winter. To be clear, under international humanitarian law, attacks targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited. So are attacks against military objectives that may be expected to cause harm to civilians that would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. Mr. President, the United Nations continues to support all efforts towards accountability. It's essential that CHR be given complete and unimpeded access to all areas of Ukraine to continue its crucial work. For its part, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine submitted its report to the General Assembly this week. The document states that there are real grounds to conclude that war crimes and violations of human rights and international humanitarian law have been committed in Ukraine since 24 February 2022. The Commission stated that Russian troops were responsible for the vast majority of the violations identified. The Commission also stated that Ukrainian armed forces have also committed international humanitarian law violations in some cases, including 2 incidents that qualify as war crimes. According to the Commission, relentless use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas has killed and injured scores of civilians and devastated entire neighborhoods. Additionally, the Commission documented patterns of summary executions, unlawful confinement, torture, ill treatment, rape, and other sexual violence committed in areas occupied by Russian forces. The impact of these violations on the people in Ukraine is immense, and so is the need for accountability. In this regard, the Commission called for a sound coordination of the multiple national and international accountability initiatives in Ukraine. Accountability remains crucial as new allegations of atrocities have emerged in areas that have recently returned to Ukrainian government control. We must not let impunity prevail. Mr. President, we welcome the announcement on Monday of another exchange of prisoners of war between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. 110 Russian captives were exchanged for 108 Ukrainians. This was the first exchange in which all freed Ukrainians were women, among them civilians, military personnel, and national and border guards. Building the constructive spirit of the prisoner exchanges, I want to reiterate the Secretary General's appeal to the Russian Federation to grant full access to the International Committee of the Red Cross to all prisoners of war in accordance with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, the impact of the war in Ukraine is substantial and growing. The UN has detailed its impact on food security, energy, and finance. The Black Sea Grain Initiative has helped to bring down food prices and stabilize and subsequently lower global food prices and move grain from the world's bread baskets to those in need. As of 19 October, the total tonnage of grain and other foodstuffs exported through the initiative had reached almost 8 million metric tons. To maintain food security worldwide, it is critical that the initiative be extended beyond November. It is equally critical that there be unimpeded access to Russian food and fertilizers. The United Nations will spare no effort to achieve greater food security for all populations. Mr. President, we're on a path of further escalation, which can only cause more suffering to the people of Ukraine, Russia, and the rest of the world. This trajectory must be reversed. Any suggestion of the possible use of nuclear or other non-conventional weapons only serves to further heighten tensions and could lead to a dangerous spiral. Any damage to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, whether intentional or by accident, could have catastrophic consequences. Any military activity against, from, or near the site must cease immediately. Mr. President, the General Assembly has been clear. Last week, the Assembly stated that the referendums held in the region of Ukraine that are or have been under temporary military control of the Russian Federation, subsequent attempted illegal annexations of these regions have no validity under international law and do not form the basis for any alteration of the status of these regions of Ukraine. This week, the Russian Federation announced the introduction of martial law of Ukraine under its temporary military control, and that it has attempted to illegally annex. This decision, combined with the announced evacuation in Kherson amid intensified fighting on the ground, raises serious concerns. Mr. President, the General Assembly also expressed strong support for the de-escalation of the current situation and a peaceful solution of the conflict through political dialogue, negotiation, mediation, and other peaceful means, with respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders and in accordance with the principles of the Charter. Indeed, an end to the war, founded on international law and the Charter, is the surest way to ensure that the tremendous suffering of the civilians in Ukraine will cease. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Denise Brown.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will speak briefly about the human toll of this war, the new dimensions of the humanitarian crisis, and the challenge of access to non-government controlled areas. Deaths and suffering of civilians ravaged urban and rural areas and total loss of livelihood for millions. This is the impact of the war on the civilian population of Ukraine, now in its 239th day. The people of Ukraine are under tremendous stress. Mental health issues are emerging, and this will be one of the most devastating and longer-lasting legacies of this war. I was recently in Mykolaiv Oblast, where the mayor told me that since the 24th of February, they have only had 33 days of silence, 33 days without explosions and air raid sirens. Let's do the math. That comes to only 1 day a week with no reprieve from the sounds and the terror, let alone the physical toll of the war. The sheer depth of the humanitarian catastrophe is staggering. Almost 18 million people, more than 40% of the entire Ukrainian population, need humanitarian assistance. Some 14 million have been forced to flee their homes, including 6.2 million internally displaced and nearly 7.7 million refugees. According to UNICEF, some 5.7 million school-aged children have been affected since the start of the war, including 3.6 million due to the closure of educational institutions. The World Health Organization says there have been over 630 verified attacks on healthcare facilities, barring the sick from medicines and treatment. The gender and protection dimensions of this crisis, while extremely sensitive, are great and need to be addressed through strengthened programming and monitoring. Mr. President, with each passing day, we face new dimensions to the humanitarian crisis. First, temperatures are plummeting in Ukraine as winter approaches. The destruction of civilian infrastructure has recently become more widespread. Energy supply, telecommunications, and transport infrastructure have been, in some areas, devastated, affecting people's access to water, electricity, and heat, and their ability to communicate. The damage to power and thermal plants means that life will be even harder for the already vulnerable, including elderly people and those with disabilities. There is also an increased risk of death in the months ahead because civilians may not have access to the essential services to survive. International humanitarian law is very clear. Attacks must never be directed against civilians or civilian objects, and constant care must be taken to spare them. To address essential needs, we, the United Nations and humanitarian community, have developed a specific plan for the winter months built at the oblast level in coordination with the authorities and in close collaboration with the government. Focuses on collective center and household repairs and the provision of blankets, mattresses, clothes, food, generators for schools, and much-needed thermal heating for hospitals. Work is underway. The aim is for civilians to have a safe, dignified, and warm place to be over the winter months. Despite the challenges, we are helping people. Already this year, more than 590 humanitarian partners are now delivering critical assistance and protection countrywide. Many of them are national, and local aid organizations, women-led organizations, and volunteers who are at the forefront of these efforts. We must commend their leadership, bravery, and commitment. Together, we have reached over 13 million people across the country, and we continue to explore options for reaching others where the need is greatest. Second, newly accessible areas mean that we can reach entirely new communities with humanitarian assistance and essential services. Aid workers are acting quickly to reach those in need, taking into consideration the security risks while upholding our commitment to stay and deliver. However, in accessible areas of Kharkiv, Kherson, and Donetsk, the threat of landmines and unexploded ordnance contamination hinders humanitarian operations. The immediate priority for the Humanitarian Mine Action sector must be to prevent civilian casualties from explosive ordnance and to help enable the safe delivery of humanitarian relief. Third, psychosocial trauma. The Ministry of Health and WHO estimate that close to 10 million people will need some kind of psychosocial support due to the trauma from this war. This includes women and girls suffering sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence, children hearing warning sirens daily, families who have been separated, or people just trying to survive every day. In areas where the government of Ukraine has regained control, particularly in rural areas, civilians who have witnessed or experienced terrible violations and ongoing hostilities are among the most at risk. Just a few weeks ago, I visited the community of Balaklia in the newly accessible district of Izum in the Kharkiv Oblast. The majority of those who remained were very old people and those who stayed behind to care for them and who were unable to flee the area. The UN and our partners are working to strengthen our capacity to address the growing psychosocial needs of Ukraine. Humanitarian access to those most in need has been a consistent challenge in this conflict. Right now, one of the most significant challenges remains access to parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia. We are extremely concerned about the people in these territories who we cannot reach. Regular requests continue to be made to cross the front line, yet we are not receiving the necessary agreement from all parties. Operationally, we are ready to move with interagency convoys and aid personnel into non-government-controlled areas. The consequences of not delivering assistance to the estimated millions of people in these areas are dire, particularly with the winter months already upon us. We must be able to alleviate the human suffering caused by this war. International humanitarian law, which already embodies a balancing act between humanity and military necessity, clearly requires parties to allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for all civilians in need and through all possible routes. Obstructions that leave the civilian population without the essentials to survive run contrary to this obligation. Finally, the flash appeal has seen unprecedented donor support. More than $2.9 billion has been received against requirements of $4.3 billion for this year. This is second most funded country-level appeal in UN history, only behind Yemen in 2019 at $3.6 billion. The Ukraine Humanitarian Fund has also received significant new funding, with more than $230 million in contributions and pledges. Of that, $117 million has already been dispersed, and we have now included $20 million for the local volunteer organizations. I thank the donors for their generous support. In closing, the people of Ukraine have shown incredible resilience in this last year. Our urgent humanitarian task is to continue to help them to survive and to be safe. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank Ms. Brown for her briefing. I now give the floor to the members of the Council who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank Under Secretary General Ms. DiCarlo and Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Ukraine, Ms. Brown. I thank them for their briefings. As we have heard, the war in Ukraine has had a devastating impact on the civilian population. Figures continue to rise. The numbers of dead people and wounded people continue to grow. civilian victims, that is, and everything suggests that these figures will continue again to rise if something more effective and urgent is not done. More than 17 million people require humanitarian aid. There are more than 7 million refugees in European countries, and there are more than 6 million internally displaced persons. And it looks very much like winter will make this scenario far more complex, and immediate action will be required. The indiscriminate attacks that have taken place in recent days against civilian infrastructure, including those using unmanned aerial vehicles, violate international humanitarian law. The dimensions of the humanitarian crisis, consequently, continue to remain on an alarming scale. It is for this reason that Mexico, together with France, called for this meeting. That is to analyze the recent dimensions of the problem and to attempt to provide solutions and alternatives. Adherence to the norms of international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and their additional protocols, is an obligation without exceptions. The provisions of these instruments are unequivocally clear. Parties must make a clear distinction between the civilian population and combatants. Moreover, it is forbidden to use weapons or methods of war which may cause unnecessary losses or excessive suffering, and the principles of necessity and proportionality must always be stringently adhered to. The impact of this conflict on healthcare services, as we have heard, has been very grave indeed. According to the World Health Organization, more than 630 attacks have been recorded against Ukraine's healthcare system. Deliberate attacks against hospitals are war crimes. They are unacceptable and they cannot go unpunished. The conflict has also had a grave impact on the mental health of the population, and that will leave an indelible mark on vast swathes of the population affected both directly and indirectly. Psychosocial support must consequently be a non-negotiable component of humanitarian assistance. Moreover, we are alarmed by reports on sexual violence and gender-based violence. All such cases must be investigated to ensure accountability and to ensure effective redress is provided to the victims, and this must be done with a gender perspective. Faced with challenges of this size, fighting underway is affecting the capacity that humanitarian actors have to operate on the ground. It is of the utmost importance to guarantee unfettered humanitarian access such that crucial services can be provided to those that need them, and this in line with the basic principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Consequently, we hail the significant mobilization of donors who have helped to finance the humanitarian response in Ukraine. However, as is always the case, needs are far outweighing finance at this time. It is likely that the civilian population's vulnerability will increase in coming months with the arrival of winter and given the serious damage done to energy infrastructure. As such, colleagues, it is urgent that attacks against civilian infrastructure cease. Moreover, the presence of mines in Ukraine is also a source of grave concern, because in addition to their impacts on the civilian population, in particular on girls and boys, the presence of these devices affects the humanitarian community's ability to operate safely. Of course, they pose grave risks too in the medium and long term. If urgent dismining work does not get underway, the Ukraine's agricultural sector will face grave challenges in the next sowing season. As such, we urge parties to reach an agreement which will make it possible to renew the Black Sea Grain Initiative. That initiative has been crucial in mitigating the impact of this war on global food security. Mr. President, my country repudiates in the strongest possible terms any threat of the use of nuclear weapons. And as such, it is timely to recall the communiqué released in January, in which nuclear weapon states stated that a nuclear war must never be fought. In this same vein, it is regrettable that we have not yet seen the establishment of a safe demilitarized zone around the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, and this in spite of the recommendations issued by the IAEA, and also in spite of the appeals launched by the Secretary General and the international community. We urge parties to heed these appeals urgently. I would conclude that the most effective way of protecting the civilian population and of ensuring the provision of humanitarian assistance is a cessation of hostilities. We will never let up in insisting on the need to seek out paths for dialogue and diplomacy which might lead us to putting an end to this war. Thank you, Mr. President.
Merci, le représentant.
I thank the representative of Mexico for their statement. I'll now give the floor to the representative of France. Mr. President, I thank Ms. DiCarlo and Ms. Brown for their briefings. 8 months after launching its war of aggression, Russia has crossed a new threshold. It is indiscriminately pounding, and has been for 10 days, the towns of Ukraine, and deliberately chose to strike civilian infrastructure, in particular energy infrastructure, in Kiev, in Sumy, in Dnipro. Russia is not even trying to hide the crimes it's committing. Russia is violating the founding principles of the United Nations and the norms and standards that stem from it, namely banning aggression, peaceful settlement of disputes, sovereignty of states, and the respect for territorial integrity. The United Nations General Assembly unequivocally and overwhelmingly condemned these attacks on our charter. By targeting civilians, Russia is deliberately violating international humanitarian law. It is vainly trying to break the morale of the Ukrainian nation. By indiscriminately striking against the Ukrainian towns and cities, Russia wants to terrorize. By destroying essential civilian infrastructure, in particular in the energy sector, Russia intends to lead to energy and heating shortfalls as the winter is approaching. It is counting on the suffering of the civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. All of the partners of Ukraine stand with it. France has mobilized the means to help Ukraine this winter. Mr. President, we urge Russia to comply with international humanitarian law and to allow the access for humanitarians to civilian populations who are in these territories which it claims to have occupied, as well as to prisoners of war, including those which are detained in Russia. We are particularly worried about them. The atrocities and the destruction which result from this aggression could constitute war crimes, and their perpetrators have to be held accountable. On the 22nd of September last, in this council, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ms. Catherine Colonna, stated that there would be no impunity for the criminals. The International Criminal Court has to move forward swiftly in its work by going up as high as possible up the chain of responsibility. France supports, together with many partners, the collection of evidence through inquiry mechanisms as well as national and international jurisdictions. Mr. President, It is now been solidly documented that the Russian armed forces use Iranian drones in Ukraine, notably to indiscriminately bomb civilian infrastructure. The provision of this equipment by Iran to Russia is a violation of Resolution 2231, as we stated together with our partners from Germany and UK in the letter sent today to members of the Council. The European Union yesterday adopted new sanctions against Iranian entities and individuals implicated in the production and transfer of the drones. France supports the appeal by Ukraine to the Secretariat to investigate and report to the members of this Council in line with its mandate. France demands that Iran immediately cease any and all form of support to the war of aggression launched by Russia against Ukraine. It demands that Russia and Iran cease violating Resolution 2231. France condemns, furthermore, the complicity of Belarus, whose territory continues being used for missile or drone strikes against Ukraine. And finally, Mr. President, the General Assembly vote last week was final. Russia is alone and massively condemned by international community. Ukraine, on the other hand, is strengthened by international solidarity. We will continue supporting the Ukrainian people for as long as is necessary. All of the humanitarian, economic, and military support that they will need will be provided to them to exercise their right of legitimate defense and safeguard their freedom. I thank you. I thank the representative of France for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and Ms. Denise Brown for their briefings. It is regrettable, Mr. President, that rather than a resort to dialogue and diplomacy to end this conflict, we are seeing an escalation of military activity. The sustained targeting of civilians and objects indispensable to survival of the civilian population, including residential homes, health facilities, shelters, as well as power and water infrastructure, is a violation of international law and international humanitarian law. Civilians continue to bear the brunt of the conflict in urban areas, as witnessed in Kyiv and cities in east and south of Ukraine. We convey our condolences to the bereaved families and wish a quick recovery to all the victims. Also alarming are the persistent threats being made of the use of weapons of mass destruction. We continue to urge for the protection of all nuclear installations, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The continued intensification of conflict will only further undermine the prospects of a longer-term negotiated peace settlement. It could also give way to the strengthening of armed alliances in preparation for a protracted war that could cause state fragility among currently stable economies in Europe and beyond. Kenya, therefore, continues to call for an immediate cessation of hostilities to allow for dialogue for a long-term solution. In the meantime, Kenya especially thanks the UN bodies and agencies, as well as other institutions and governments, for their steadfast efforts to alleviate suffering in every possible way. We continue to call for these UN agencies to be granted unhindered humanitarian access to those in need. Mr. President, in already food insecure regions, especially in Africa, due to extreme weather conditions and conflict, the war in Ukraine has worsened the situation. It has disrupted global food supply chains, creating shortages and sharp increases in prices. The Black Sea Grain Initiative and the agreement to ensure unimpeded exports of Russian food and fertilizer to world markets were a promising start, and we continue to advocate for its maintenance. We also urge that any efforts to deploy emergency food and energy security mechanisms in industrialized countries be accompanied by efforts to transform food systems in food insecure regions. A major part of this endeavor would be making the necessary investments to ensure that Africa is food self-sufficient. Mr. President, the last two world wars came as a surprise. We do not want this war in Ukraine to be remembered as the beginning of a third world war or for it to lead to the fracturing of the global governance system. It is high time that all states directly and indirectly involved in this conflict to open channels of communication. They should use them to explore the conditions that can lead to a cessation of hostilities, followed by a negotiation that addresses the war in Ukraine and stabilizes the European security order. It is also time for states with influence, reach, and vision for a stable global order to begin a conversation on the next steps to advance a worldwide demand for a dialogue regarding Ukraine and other major security flashpoints. It is also time for Security Council reform efforts to accelerate. Without reform to permanent membership, the present format will lose its relevance and be overtaken by competing multilateral arrangements. Kenya reiterates once again its respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, the recent period has witnessed continued intensification of the conflict on the ground in Ukraine, the constantly deteriorating humanitarian situation, and the ever bleaker prospects for peace, which China finds most concerning. The crisis, nearly 8 months long, has taken a heavy toll on ordinary people, put the world, especially developing countries, under tremendous stress, and exposed global economic development to severe shocks. We must prevent the conflict from becoming ever more prolonged, expanded, and complicated, make every effort to mitigate its humanitarian consequences, contain its spillover effects, and work tirelessly together to promote the de-escalation and cooling down of the situation and the early realization of ceasefire and cessation of hostilities. Today, I wish to emphasize the following 3 imperatives. First, to effectively comply with international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law is a code of conduct that parties in a conflict situation must all abide by. Civilians and civilian facilities should be fully protected, and all parties should facilitate the evacuation of people and the provision of humanitarian relief. Nuclear power plants, energy pipelines, bridges and other critical infrastructure are of great importance to public safety and social stability and should not be the target of military attacks. All parties involved should exercise maximum restraint, avoid words and actions that exacerbate confrontation and cause miscalculation, and prevent the conflict from further escalating and expanding and from sliding to a more dangerous brink. Second, to step up continuously humanitarian assistance. The nearly 8 months of intense conflict have led to a severe shortage of supplies in many places, and the basic public services such as water, electricity, heating, and medical care are difficult to secure. As winter approaches, millions of people, especially women, children, and other vulnerable groups, need to rely on humanitarian aid to eke out a living. China appreciates the efforts of international humanitarian agencies and Ukraine's neighboring countries to mitigate the humanitarian crisis and calls on the international community to continue to provide assistance to Ukraine under the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, and to continue to help its neighboring countries to share the pressure in order to ensure the proper resettlement of all conflict-affected people. Third, to make every effort to contain the spillover effects. In the era of globalization, the implementation of all-round, indiscriminate sanctions will only accelerate the transmission of the crisis, push up international commodity prices, destabilize the global industrial and supply chain, and leave all countries in the world, not least developing countries, exposed to the deleterious impact. The international community should get united and work together to maintain the uninterrupted operation of global food, energy, and financial markets and remove political obstacles to international economic and trade cooperation. Maintaining and expanding the return of Ukrainian and Russian food and fertilizers to the international market is important for stabilizing global food prices and securing the supply of agricultural products. China supports the continued effective implementation of the Black Sea Green Initiative and the memorandum on the export of Russian food and fertilizers. Mr. President, peace is the fundamental solution to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and the only way to achieve long-term peace and stability in Ukraine and the region at large. No matter how great the difficulties and challenges are, the door to a political settlement cannot be closed, the process of diplomatic negotiations cannot be stalled, and efforts to stop the war and promote talks cannot be slackened. The facts of the past 8 months have proven that sanctions and pressure, bloc confrontation, and political isolation are not effective ways to resolve the crisis. The international community should focus on encouraging peace talks and seeking a political solution by persuading the parties to resume peace talks and stop fighting at an early date in an effort to achieve the soonest a peaceful solution to the crisis. China's position on the Ukraine issue is as clear as it is consistent. We empathize with the Ukrainian people for their plight. China has put forward a 6-point initiative on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and an international food security cooperation initiative, and has provided batches of emergency humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. As a responsible country, China will continue to play a constructive role in promoting peace talks and continue to make positive contributions to alleviating the humanitarian crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of China for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking USG Rosemary DiCarlo and UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Ukraine, Ms. Denise Brown, for their respective briefings on the situation in Ukraine with regard to the protection of civilians and the humanitarian situation. India continues to remain concerned over the situation in Ukraine. The conflict has resulted in loss of lives and countless miseries for its peoples, particularly for women, children, and elderly, with millions becoming homeless and forced to take shelter in neighboring countries. Reports of attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in the recent weeks is deeply worrying. We reiterate our grave concern in this regard. International principles and jurisprudence vest responsibility on parties to the conflict to ensure that civilians and civilian infrastructure are not targeted in situations of armed conflict. Civilians in conflict-affected areas need safe, unhindered, and rapid access to basic services, often provided by humanitarian workers. As we have been reiterating in this Council, all humanitarian aid and assistance must be primarily guided by the universal principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures must not be politicized. Mr. President, since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, India has consistently called for immediate cessation of hostilities and an end to the violence. India has called upon both sides to return to the path of diplomacy and dialogue, and also expressed its support for all diplomatic efforts to end the conflict. we believe that no solution can be arrived at the cost of innocent lives. Our Prime Minister has spoken to the presidents of Ukraine and Russia on multiple occasions and reiterated India's position. India stands ready to support all such efforts aimed at de-escalation. The impact of Ukraine conflict is not just limited to Europe. The conflict is exacerbating concerns over food, fertilizer, and fuel security, particularly in the developing countries. It is necessary for all of us to adequately appreciate the importance of equity, affordability, and accessibility on these critical issues for the Global South. Open markets must not become an argument to perpetuate inequity and promote discrimination. In this context, we hope that the grain deal agreed in June will be implemented by all parties earnestly. However, we believe this alone may not be sufficient to address the food security concerns. Mr. President, India's approach to the Ukraine conflict will continue to be people-centric. On our part, we are providing both humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to some of our neighbors in the Global South under economic distress, even as they stare at the escalating costs of food, of fuel, and of fertilizers, which has been a consequential fallout of the ongoing conflict. We hope that the international community will continue to respond positively to the calls for humanitarian assistance. We support calls urging for guarantees of safe passage to deliver essential humanitarian and medical supplies. India has so far dispatched 12 consignments of humanitarian aid to Ukraine and stands ready to do more. In conclusion, Mr. President, let me reiterate that the global order is anchored in the principles of the UN Charter, international law, and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. I thank you.
Je remercie
I thank the representative of India for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, I'd like to begin by thanking Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and Resident Coordinator Denise Brown for their briefings. As we heard today, a significant percentage of critical civilian infrastructure, including power stations and water supply infrastructure, has either been damaged or destroyed. In just 1 week, a third of Ukraine's power stations are reported to have been knocked off the electricity grid at a critical time, leaving people without gas for cooking and heating with winter approaching. As the war continues, Ukrainians' needs for humanitarian aid are compounded further. The international community must step up its support to alleviate the suffering of civilians and ensure that their basic needs are covered. To this end, the UAE announced $100 million in humanitarian aid to Ukraine earlier this week. However, other parts of the world cannot be neglected. We must ensure that those most in need globally do not become an afterthought. Access remains a major hurdle for humanitarian organizations, particularly in the areas witnessing the most intense fighting in eastern Ukraine. Those unable to escape the fighting, such as people with disabilities, the elderly, and the sick, have become vulnerable to shifting battle lines. We commend the efforts of humanitarian organizations in this context and urge cooperation by the parties to resolve all impediments to access. We once again reiterate our call on parties to abide by their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, to ensure the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure. Civilian objects must never be a target of attack. Mr. President, despite the deeply concerning developments in the conflict, we have seen some movement between the parties that has led to tangible, positive outcomes on concrete issues. While momentum towards broader negotiations is still lacking, prisoner exchanges, including the exchange announced earlier this week, show the potential for positive outcomes. The agreements to facilitate the export of food and fertilizers were significant and positive steps that contributed to a decline in the index for global food prices. Nevertheless, the full implementation, expansion, and extension of the agreements remains critical to address global food insecurity. Compromise, diplomacy, and dialogue remain the only way forward to prevent further suffering. We commend the United Nations and others who have worked to facilitate constructive engagement between the parties. Mr. President, the world wants peace in Ukraine, a peace that is sustainable and in accordance with the UN Charter and international law. There is no alternative to a cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine and a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you. Mr. President, let me start by thanking both our briefers for their informative interventions. I'll make 2 comments on the subject. First, Brazil regrets that after nearly 8 months of conflict in Ukraine, the civilian population continues to suffer. There is no justification for attacks perpetrated on civilian targets, such as those recorded in Kiev and other major Ukrainian cities in the last few days. The damage to the energy sector, which according to reports by our embassy in Kiev has reached 30% of its generating capacity, is particularly worrisome. The rigors of the coming winter will add to the humanitarian crisis. The continuing reports of civilian casualties and attacks against civilian infrastructure attest to the urgency of opening channels of humanitarian dialogue between the parties. Brazil recalls the obligations of all states under international law and of all parties under international humanitarian law. Missile launches and drone strikes must be halted. Unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance to those in need should be guaranteed by all parties. My second point, we believe it's important to discuss our collective response to the conflict. In our discussions with other delegations, we note increased frustration with what is perceived as insufficient efforts by the Council to facilitate a peaceful solution. Many are disappointed with the fact that divisions have prevailed over what is expected from us, the willingness to engage in dialogue. Mr. President, the UN Charter outlawed war as a legitimate means of resolving conflicts. Reaffirming this principle is essential, but not sufficient, in light of our collective responsibilities. This Council should actively contribute to all possible efforts towards a ceasefire and to negotiations between the parties. Different ideas have been circulated by other delegations to facilitate direct talks between the parties. The Council should explore them. Brazil is willing to engage in these efforts and invites other members to consider new paths in order to abbreviate the suffering of the Ukrainian people. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Undersecretary General DiCarlo and Humanitarian Coordinator Brown for your briefings. Colleagues, Russia has shown again and again that it disregards the UN Charter and international law. We are in this chamber today because of the mounting consequences and human toll of Russia's unprovoked and unlawful invasion of its neighbor and fellow UN member state. As we just heard, there are 7.7 million Ukrainians living as refugees and over 6 million more displaced in Ukraine. That is nearly 1/3 of the population that cannot go home. Nearly half the population needs humanitarian assistance. And as Ms. Brown explained, needs will exacerbate in the winter. And as needs increase, Russia's forces hit civilian infrastructure and humanitarian convoys with renewed relentlessness. undermining the civilian population's ability to survive cold winter temperatures. This includes a massive barrage against Ukraine's cities on October 10, which the Secretary General called, quote, another unacceptable escalation, close quote, of the war. As insecurity, broken supply chains, and mass displacement hamper healthcare across Ukraine, a UN partner reports some 500 attacks by Russia's forces on healthcare personnel, facilities, and transportation between February 24 and September 7. As humanitarian organizations scale up efforts to reach recently retaken areas, Russia's retaliatory strikes and the prevalence of landmines pose safety risks to humanitarian personnel and other civilians. The UN estimates 4.3 billion will be needed to provide Ukrainians with humanitarian aid. Since February, the United States has provided over 1.5 billion in assistance to this end. We urge countries to help the UN meet these goals as we continue to stand firmly behind the Ukrainian people. From the beginning of its full-scale invasion, Russia has shown contempt for this Council. This continues with evidence that since August, and in violation of the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, Iran has transferred Mohajer and Shahed series UAVs to Russia. These Iranian-origin UAVs have been subsequently used in multiple attacks against Ukraine, including the massive barrage on October 10, which hit civilians and civilian infrastructure. In addition to the easily identifiable remnants of these UAVs recovered in Ukraine, there is significant publicly available documentation, including photographs and video of these UAVs being used against Ukraine. The UN must investigate any violations of UN Security Council resolutions, and we must not allow Russia or others to impede or threaten the UN from carrying out its mandated responsibilities. We take this opportunity to refute resolutely Russia's false assertion that Geneva Conventions do not apply to captured foreign volunteers. Russia's obligations as a party to the Geneva Conventions and their first additional protocol apply to its detention and treatment of any individuals in the armed conflict. Members of Ukraine's armed forces, including third country national volunteers, must be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions and afforded the treatment and protections commensurate with that status. Finally, we cannot forget the spillover effects of this war, which have exacerbated global food insecurity. We must continue to champion the efforts of and work to renew the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Under this initiative, more than 300 ships with over 7 million metric tons of grain and other food have left Ukraine's ports. As the UN has pointed out, the initiative helps calm markets and limit food price inflation. In fact, the UN Food and Agricultural's Food Price Index has fallen since its spike at the start of the war, and wheat prices are back at pre-war levels. We cannot tolerate any backsliding at the expense of the world's hungry. In conclusion, Mr. President, let me say to the countries on this council that over the many months since the escalation of this conflict have never mentioned Russia. I would say this: if women matter, urge Russia to silence its guns. If children matter, ask Russia to withdraw its forces. If the UN Charter matters, call on Russia to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Vague calls for diplomacy only enable Russia as it commits further abuses. We in this chamber, charged with the protection of global peace and security, must continue to call for accountability and Russia's immediate cessation of its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, President. I also want to thank Under Secretary General DiCarlo and Ms Brown for your briefings. Mr President, we meet at the end of another critical week for Ukraine and its people. They struggle daily with massive disruption to vital power and water supplies, the result of continued attacks by the Russian Federation on Ukraine's critical civilian infrastructure. Direct attacks on hospitals and healthcare facilities, places of care and refuge. Many are now only partially functional or reliant on limited backup power. Russian attacks have also hit residential buildings, killing civilians as they sleep. The people of Ukraine are paying the ultimate price for a senseless war not of their choosing. While the world has called for peace, the Russian Federation has instead chosen the path of escalation in this war. Across Ukraine, we have seen explosive weapons, including prohibited cluster munitions, being used in populated areas and against civilian infrastructure. Landmines jeopardising civilians, agricultural production, food security and safe humanitarian access. Ireland is concerned by the use of Iranian-supplied unmanned aerial vehicles that bring death, destruction and horror to the streets of Kyiv and elsewhere. Their acquisition by Russia would contravene Security Council Resolution 2231. These attacks on civilian targets appear to have just one goal in mind: to intimidate and terrorise the civilian population. They represent a blatant disregard for human life, they constitute a serious violation of international law, and they are simply unconscionable. We once again call on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. We urge the Russian Federation to refrain from further escalation, to take all feasible measures to prevent civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure, and to facilitate life-saving humanitarian access without delay. We have just heard how critical this is as winter approaches, with the most vulnerable in Ukrainian society, internally displaced persons, women, children and the elderly, facing a particularly precarious future. Mr President, the people of Ukraine have shown remarkable resolve and determination in the face of such brutal adversity. Ireland stands with them today, as always. For our part, we are determined that the Russian Federation will be held to account for its heinous actions. There are rules, even in war, and when those rules are broken, there must be accountability. Accountability for the targeting of civilians, for arbitrary detention, human trafficking and conflict-related sexual violence. In all situations where international crimes may have been committed, we must ensure that timely, credible investigations are undertaken, that evidence is rigorously documented, and that witnesses, victims and survivors are supported. Last week, the General Assembly delivered a clear message of support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. This was not just about Ukraine, but about protecting the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, the very basis for our rules-based international order. Through that same Charter, the members of these United Nations conferred on this Council the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. For exactly 8 months now, the Russian Federation has acted with utter disregard for this responsibility. It continues to bring wanton death and destruction to Ukraine through its illegal war of aggression. Today, I appeal to my fellow members of this Council to assert our responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, to stand united in calling on the Russian Federation to end this war and withdraw from the entire territory of Ukraine, and to support all efforts of dialogue and diplomacy to bring about a peaceful resolution of this conflict. Thank you, Mr President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, President. I wish to begin my statement by thanking Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and Ms. Denise Brown, the United Nations Resident Humanitarian Coordinator in Ukraine, for their important but sobering briefings on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Now in its 8th month, the unjustified aggression against Ukraine has been marked by overwhelming suffering, death, and destruction. Too many people, especially the women, children, and the elderly, continue to suffer needlessly from the fighting that has engulfed many cities across Ukraine. The humanitarian statistics, as reported, are indeed concerning, but can only be expected to rise should the fighting continue in the way we are witnessing. It is also important to note the impact of the war on pre-existing humanitarian situations in other parts of the world where food aid is largely supplied from Ukraine. The growing threats of the use of unconventional weapons and possible nuclear engagements have been the source of global uncertainty. Ghana calls for the de-escalation of tensions, the immediate cessation of hostilities, and the intensification of diplomatic efforts to end the war now, rather than later when the cost of reconciliation and reconstruction would be unbearable. It is of utmost importance for the Security Council and the wider international community to forge consensus on concrete measures and pathways to stem the rising tensions and begin a political dialogue for settlement. We welcome in this regard the continuing leadership and pacific role of the Secretary General and hope that further gains can be made in the endeavors for peaceful settlement. We're grateful to the United Nations humanitarian agencies and their partners who are working under extremely difficult and dangerous operational circumstances. We pay our respects to all humanitarian workers who have fallen while in the service to mankind in Ukraine. Their commitment and sacrifice to bring relief to the suffering people must be matched by the international community's efforts in helping to end the war. We welcome the humanitarian aid support and contributions by some states and international agencies to see Ukrainians through the winter season. Food, water, shelter, warm clothing, and medication would be critical to the survival of some 6.5 million people internally displaced by the war. We call on both parties to grant humanitarian access to all areas where people require assistance and urge the Russian authorities in particular to grant unhindered humanitarian access into the occupied territories. As fighting intensifies, we deem it necessary for new humanitarian corridors to be created for the safe passage of civilians to areas of relative safety. We recall the success of the Mariupol evacuations and urge similar arrangements as a matter of urgency. We condemn all human rights violations and reiterate our support for independent, transparent, and thorough investigations of such violations, including conflict-related sexual violence. The happenings in Bucha and Irpin must strengthen our resolve to hold the perpetrators of such acts to account and avoid impunity. The parties must refrain from targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure and other critical infrastructure. Apart from imposing severe hardships on the people, the deliberate destruction of critical energy infrastructure, residential facilities, water stations, healthcare facilities, schools, and transport infrastructure constitute gross violations of international law and the principles of international humanitarian law relating to armed conflict. In closing, Mr. President, we reiterate our complete commitment for the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and remain supportive of international efforts to alleviate the humanitarian suffering of the Ukrainian people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Thank you again, Under-Secretary General DiCarlo, for your briefing. And thank you, Resident Coordinator Brown, for your invaluable update on the situation on the ground and the work the UN team is doing in the toughest of circumstances. So far, this war has killed, maimed, and psychologically damaged thousands of people. Millions have been forced to flee. Ukrainian towns and cities have been reduced to rubble, with evidence of atrocities left behind in the ruins. We have heard unbearable stories of sexual violence. And the real objectives of the invasion have been exposed by Russia's attempts to suppress Ukrainian national identity and culture and illegally annex Ukrainian land, an act widely condemned by the UN membership last week. Unfortunately, an already appalling situation appears to be getting worse. Under the command of General Sergei Surovkin, a man infamous for brutalities against civilians in Syria, we have seen a renewed campaign of drone and missile strikes across Ukraine. Heavily populated areas have been hit, as well as playgrounds, traffic in rush hour, and apartment buildings nowhere near front lines or military installations. A new wave of bombardment has deliberately targeted critical national infrastructure, leaving some 30% of Ukraine's power stations damaged or destroyed. These are attacks on Ukrainian civilians' way of life, and they are a clear breach of international humanitarian law. They are egregious in their own right, but even worse as winter approaches. Russian attacks mean that Ukrainians are losing their ability to heat their homes and cook their food. The intent behind these attacks is clear. Russia is seeking to subjugate Ukraine by terrorizing civilians. And it is doing so using weaponry obtained for Iran in violation of Security Council Resolution 2231. Now, Russia's been trying to distract us with attacks on the UN's integrity, its mandate to investigate. But Resolution 2231 is clear. It asks the Secretary General to report to the Council on its implementation, and there's extensive precedent for site visits to consider evidence. Of course, the key issue is that wherever these drones come from, their use against civilians is barbaric. President, Russia's actions are illegal and immoral, and they must come to an end. So once again, we call on Russia to stop its disinformation and misdirection and its accusations that the West is somehow responsible for its own atrocities. We call on Russia to heed the calls of the international community, respect its obligations under international law, and stop attacks on civilians, energy infrastructure, hospitals, and health facilities. And we call on Russia, yet again, to end this war and return to the path of dialogue it abandoned in February. Finally, President, we recognize, as others have, the wider negative impact of Russia's war. The positive impact of the Black Sea Grain Initiative on global grain prices is clear, and we've heard more about that today. So we welcome and encourage efforts by the Secretary General to ensure the continuation of the agreement. You have the UK's full support. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. Let me first thank the briefers for their candid words to the Council today. Their accounts leave no doubt about the devastation this war has brought upon the people of Ukraine. Norway will continue to stand with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people against this Russian aggression, which is a gross violation of international law and the UN Charter. We are alarmed by the escalation and brutality of the recent Russian attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure with missiles and drones. These attacks, which seem deliberate, have killed civilians and hit several power facilities across Ukraine. Damage to energy infrastructure brings great humanitarian harm and will certainly cause illness and death when the cold winter arrives. These attacks have no military purpose. The aim seems to be to terrorize the population. They are illegal and may constitute war crimes. Those responsible must be personally held to account. Russia's devastating attacks against cities and urban areas over the last 8 months have killed and maimed civilians, including children, and led to massive displacement, both internally and across borders. We are concerned about sexual and gender-based violence and human trafficking that women and unaccompanied children are particularly exposed to. We must facilitate their return, the delivery of essential services, and mitigate the long-term effects that Russia's war has imposed on them. President, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry has concluded that violation of human rights and international humanitarian law amounting to war crimes have been committed by Russian armed forces. The killing of civilians, mass graves, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, forced disappearance, and torture have all been recorded, along with reports of deportation to Russia and adjustment to procedures to allow Russians to adopt Ukrainian children without the consent of their parents, and more. The victims deserve justice. Survivors must be cared for, and those responsible must be held accountable. But to stop this grotesque violation in the first place, this war must come to an end. Russia must withdraw its troops from within the internationally recognized border of Ukraine and stop the war. President, Norway also remains concerned by the many unaccounted for prisoners of war and others who are missing because of this conflict. We call on the parties at all levels to comply with their obligation under international humanitarian law. This includes support for the International Committee of the Red Cross in fulfilling their unique mandate as laid out in the Geneva Conventions, including visiting prisoners of war. President, we commend the international and national humanitarian responders for their bravery in delivering humanitarian protection and assistance to those in need. It is critical that humanitarian actors have full, safe, and unhindered access to all those in need. We are particularly concerned about the situation for the elderly, disabled, and children in conflict-affected areas. President, while this war is raging, the world is facing a food crisis. Continuation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative is vital, and we appreciate the tireless effort of the Secretary General. In times of war, we need this beacon of hope. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, I would like to, in the very beginning, express my puzzlement. We do not entirely understand what is the value added, other than extending the time of the meeting today, is in including in our list the representative of Slovakia, Poland, Germany, and Greece. We do not have it's not a debate that we're having today, but a briefing. And the position of those countries is very well known to us anyway, and it could very well be summed up by the representative of the EU. It's nothing by the desire to show their faces on international TV screens. In future, Mr. President, we would like you to be more careful when compiling the list of those who will be speaking on at such meetings. Mr. President, we note the briefing provided by the Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and the resident humanitarian coordinator in Ukraine, Ms. Denise Brown. Resident coordinator in Ukraine, Ms. Denise Brown. We can see that the UN Secretariat has finally become concerned with the topic of the civilian infrastructure destruction. Unfortunately, once again, this is a one-sided picture. We didn't hear a word about the destruction that Kiev has been for 8 years inflicting and continues inflicting in Donbass, nor has we heard anything about the victims amongst the civilians from the Ukrainian armed forces. There is no reaction whatsoever by the Secretary to the horrendous acts of terror by Kiev against such civilian infrastructure as a bridge in Crimea, the shellings of the Zaporozhye NPP and the Kakhovska power plant. The need for the meeting today, our Western colleagues explained by the intensification of strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure and civilian objects by the Russian side. All right, let's take a look at what the situation is actually like. In the past 2 months, the Ukrainian regime and its Western backers who probably were euphoric because of tactical movement of Ukrainian forces in some areas, which was arrived at as a result of an astronomical losses in personnel and equipment, have been rehashing the idea that Russia supposedly exhausted its material and people's resources and is just about to start losing on the battlefield. Parallel to that, the Ukrainian strategies, with a backing from Western masters, have for a long time been using terrorist methods of sabotage on the Russian territory. There are many examples of that. By the peak of that was the act of terror on the Crimean Bridge on the 8th of October, conducted by Ukrainian special forces. 4 people died. Partially, the road was destroyed. The road which ensures supplies to the peninsula of foodstuffs, medicines, and other vital necessities. The Ukrainian officials, including the Deputy Prime Minister, the head of the Ministry on Digital Transformation of Ukraine, Mikhail Fedorov, and the Ministerial Advisor, Gerashenko, openly savored this crime. There were ecstatic announcements about that made on the official account of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, and even though Kiev was probably reined in by the Western masters very quickly and traditionally tried to shift the blame on Russia, nonetheless, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Dmitry Kuleba, in an internet video confirmed that what is behind the attacks against the Crimean Bridge and Belgorod Oblast is Kiev. Here are his words, which became available to millions of internet users. I quote, "If you ask me who blew up in Crimea and Belgorod, well, privately, I will tell you then, yes, it's us." End of quote. After 8 years' experience in Donbass, we know very well what the Kiev regime is capable of. We therefore decided to dampen the fervor of overreaching terrorists in Kiev. High-precision missile strikes and Russian drones hit a large number of military targets, including the objects of infrastructure, which undermine the military possibility and the potential of the anti-people Zelensky regime. Of course, this did not sit well with the West, and they became hysterical. And this is what we're witnessing loudly and clearly today at the meeting. Obviously, as was the case earlier, they do not want to face facts and acknowledge that the civilian objects were only hit in those cases when the drones were targeted right next to the target by Ukrainian territorial defense and therefore had to change their course, or when the civilian objects were hit by Ukrainian air defense who couldn't intercept their targets. There are plenty of cases like that. They exist on video. Anyone wants to look them up. Ukraine today and its Western backers are trying to publicize yet another fake about the alleged supplies into Russia of Ukrainian drones in violation of Resolution 2231. We reject any attempts to involve into this dirty undertaking the UN Secretariat. And the example of that is the letter disseminated today, the letter from Germany, France, and UK, which basically appeals to the Secretariat to violate its Article 100 of the Charter and the mandate they have in the Presidential of Security Council President Note S-2016-44 of January 2016. The United States went further and in their letter demanded that the Secretariat command an investigation which the Secretariat has no authority to do. This is an outrageous situation, and we have provided our legal views in an open letter which we disseminated prior to this meeting today. And we expect that the Secretariat will provide us with a definitive confirmation that they will not intend to follow the instructions from Western countries in violation of the Charter and will not conduct any investigation. If experts of the UN to please Western capital nonetheless start conducting a pseudo-investigation baselessly referring into Resolution 2231, we can reconsider the entire package of our relationship with the UN Secretariat, because in this case it will not be possible to call it an impartial. Distinguished colleagues, the show in the Security Council today is a smokescreen for the Kiev regime and its backers. The West is trying to paint the Kiev regime as an innocent victim of Russian aggression, which needs constant military assistance. Last week, announcements were made about new supplies to Kiev of military goods. United States and the European Union decided to choose those systems specifically which show themselves to be most lethal against the people of Donbass and the liberated territories. The United States will give Kiev yet another portion of HIMARS equipment and the high-precision missiles M31 GMLRS and the aviation anti-radar missiles AGM-88 HARM. Paris will give Kiev yet another portion of self-propelled artillery Caesar with 155mm caliber. 155mm ammunition to Kiev is announced by Germany. And the leadership of this country explained to their own people that this is to help the Zelensky regime in protecting Ukraine. Well, let's take a look how they're actually being used. According to DNR and LNR, only on their territory from February to October, the Ukrainian shelling using heavy weaponry resulted in damage to more than 10,000 buildings and more than 2,000 civilian infrastructure entities. This includes 424 education facilities and 109 medical facilities. American HIMARS were actively used for this shelling. The French Caesars also showed how powerful they were when fighting residential buildings, schools, and other civilian objects. As a result of French armament supplies, since June in Donetsk, no less than 5 people died, 10 were injured, 64 buildings destroyed. The Ukrainian armed forces are only striking again into Russian territory, targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure on the 10th of October. Belgorod Oblast was shelled by more than 100 missiles, including the infamous Tochka U with a cluster warhead. A woman died, 4 buildings damaged. In the village of Tetkino in Kursk, which has been shelled since the spring, despite the fact that there are no military objects there, 2 people were injured. On the 13th of October, the Ukrainians shelled a large residential building in Belgorod. The village Krasnoye was shelled, a customs post near Shebekin, and other civilian entities. Just now, on the eve of the meeting, Ukrainian armed forces destroyed industrial enterprises in that district. I would like to recall that earlier in this region, as well as in Donetsk, Ukrainian armed forces actively and indiscriminately used remote mining systems against civilians, including the Lepestok mines, the Petal mines. On the 16th of October, residential buildings in Nikolsk were shelled, the international airport in Belgorod. 2 civilians were injured. On the 18th of October, the Ukrainian military once again shelled the Belaya Berezka village. On the same day, they attacked 6 towns in the Kursk Oblast. 1 woman was hurt, a number of buildings and a number of electricity supply lines. Prior to that, Ukrainian saboteurs have tried on several occasions to commit an act of sabotage against the Kursk NPP. Since October, through indiscriminate artillery shelling, using the American missiles HARM, more than 30 peaceful townships in Belgorod and Belgorod itself were shelled. Well, at the same time, Kiev, encouraged by the Western patrons, is openly boasting about that. Is it possible that Kiev and those who are covering up these things think that we will acquiesce to that? Using their permission to commit any crime, the permission given by the Western backers, the Zelensky regime is consistently striking civilian infrastructure on its own former territory. The Ukrainian armed forces for 5 months have been shelling the town of Novaya Kakhovka in the Khersonsk Oblast. Up to 120 missiles strike in a day, most of them American HIMARS. And the Ukrainians target them specifically at the Kakhovska Dam so as to break it, which will result in the raising of the water level, and this will flood the adjacent territories. And this could result in the death of thousands of civilians, and thousands of buildings will be damaged. We disseminated today in the Security Council our letter calling upon the UN leadership to prevent this horrendous provocation. reckless attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces against the Zaporozhye NPP continues, and this creates dangers to nuclear safety. The number of victims, civilian victims, if the NPP is seriously damaged, not to mention what will happen when there's a fully fledged accident with a leak, is of no concern to Kiev. They are prepared for any human victims to make sure that NATO can continue its proxy war with Russia and continue supplying Ukraine with armaments. We continuously inform UN leadership about these outrageous incidents, but haven't heard anything intelligible by way of reaction from it so far. The Ukrainian fighters managed to seriously damage the Kakhovsky and Antonovsky bridges against Dnieper. They were used by the citizens of Kherson to receive food, medicines, etc. Another attempt to destroy the Antonovsky bridge was undertaken on the 19th of October. The Russian air defense systems managed to protect the bridge. For these attacks, once again, the American HIMARS systems were used. The Ukrainian fighters also used HIMARS earlier so as to strike against the detention facility for Azov in Yelenovska. Another horrendous illustration of how the Kiev authorities treat the peaceful people is the executions of their own nationals who decided to opt for Russia on the 20th of September. The Ukrainians executed an automobile convoy near Kupiansk. They were leaving Ukraine towards Russia. About 30 people died. On the 30th of September, once again, the refugees who were leaving for the liberated territories in Zaporozhye were hit. 30 people died. 88 people were injured. Yesterday, on the 20th of October, Ukrainian armed forces shelled a ferry which was used to evacuate civilians who were trying to save themselves from shells. As a result of that, there are wounded and killed, including journalists and people. On the 4th of October, there was an open appeal from military personnel of the 25th Storm Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Force. In it, they said that they received a criminal order to totally eliminate the peaceful population in the Kharkov Oblast. The Minister of Interior in Ukraine made a statement that they would start to eliminate the enemies of Ukraine. As a result, in the Kharkov Oblast, per day they detain up to 40 so-called collaborators. What happens to them thereafter, we saw in the video on the 9th of October, where a member of the Azov unit, Maxim Zhorin, talks about. It shows that the bodies of the executed civilians are being thrown into a ditch. Zhorin himself said that these are the citizens of Kupiansk and commented, I quote, saying, "The punishment will come." The metadata of this video show that it was recorded slightly more than 30 minutes before the publication. The bodies are wearing warm clothes, which is in line with October. The Russian forces have been absent from Kupiansk since September, and this shows that these people have been executed by Ukrainian neo-Nazis as part of their cleansing of the city. Have we heard one word with condemnation of this from Western delegations? And your silence shows that you're hypocritical. You're not at all worried about the fate of civilians in Ukraine. You prefer to cover up this criminal regime, which counts in its ranks nationalists, radicals, and open Nazis. Help them with its provocations and spreading lies about Russia and Russian armed forces. Once again, I would like to, by the way, recall that despite all of the reminders of ours, we have not received a list of Ukrainian victims in Bucha in April. This shows it once again that the Kievan authorities have nothing as evidence to provide to confirm their accusations. Our Western colleagues are trying to say that there's nothing that needs to be proven. All we need to do is just take the words of the representative of the Kiev regime at face value. Mr. President, before concluding, I'd like to warn in advance that listening to yet another portion of spiteful tirades from the representative of the Ukrainian regime in the Security Council, and thus provide him with very strange and perverse pleasure that he gets from that, is not something that I will do. All those who are familiar with his recent boorish insults against Russian diplomats and social networks will know what I'm referring to. Regrettably, such outbursts reflect the current state of Ukrainian diplomacy and show Kiev's inability and lack of readiness for any kind of dialogue, much less for a civilized one. I thank you.
Je remercie le...
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, USG DiCarlo and Resident Coordinator Brown, for your information on the situation in Ukraine. Since 24th February this year, every of our meetings on Ukraine has started on a most sobering way, deploring an unjustified aggression, expressing deep concerns for the useless loss of life, and repeating unheeded calls for Russia to stop. This one is no different, as the situation has not changed, and the next week will mark exactly 8 months since the special Russian madness started in Ukraine. I wish nonetheless like to pause for a moment, get out of the grim situation and congratulate Ukraine and its people for receiving the Sakharov Prize awarded last week by the European Parliament, praising Ukrainians who are standing up for what we all believe in, defending themselves but fighting for common values, protecting democracy, freedom and rule of law. It is as symbolic as meaningful. Mr. President, Ukraine remains the only place in Europe where, since February, sirens sound day and night. Thousands of people have died and have been injured, most of them caused by use of explosive weapons, including shelling, missiles, and airstrikes. Attacks against civil infrastructure, including damage of residential buildings, schools and hospitals, healthcare facilities, have continued affecting people's access to critical services. Now Russia is escalating it and is targeting key civilian infrastructure, namely energy installations, but also residential areas, with the clear aim to terrorize population, inflict severe damage, and leave entire families, women and children, without water, electricity, and heating while winter is approaching. This is another and higher level of cruelty. Moreover, it is now being carried out with the extended malicious hand of Iran, notoriously known for its destabilizing policies, through an open breach of Security Council Resolution 2231. We call on the UN not to yield to threats, but undertake an adequate verification of reports that hundreds of drones used by Russian forces in Ukraine have been unlawfully imported from Iran, as part of the regular report of the Secretary General on the implementation of Resolution 2231 in accordance with Para 7 on Note 44. It is there, everybody can verify it. After all, my question, and maybe not only mine, is what Russia has to hide from an independent, impartial investigation, a routine exercise to examine evidence, and that the Secretariat has done plenty of times. Didn't they agree for a similar inquiry from the UN Secretariat after the bombing of a prison where more than 50 prisoners were killed in Donbass, which still remains unelucidated? Mr. President, last March in this chamber, I asked OCHA if they were able to corroborate allegations of sexual violence used by Russian soldiers. It was not an accusation, but a request for information and clarity. The Russian delegation reacted, stating that Russian soldiers would never commit such acts as they have high standards and rules. Guess what? Now we have UN reports compiled after meticulous investigation which say that they had documented patterns of summary executions, unlawful confinement, torture, ill treatment, rape, and other sexual violence committed in areas occupied by Russian armed forces. Such despicable behaviors seem not to have spared children, including, allegedly, a 4-year-old girl, a baby. The Commission of Inquiry reports that sometimes family members, including children, were forced to witness these crimes. This is simply sickening and doesn't meet any known standards of human behavior, let alone military discipline. And these are no high standards. These are monstrous activities, crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and one day they will be presented before the court. Mr. President, let me highlight another worry. Weeks after Russia and Belarus announced the formation of a new joint force, and days after the force started to assemble in Belarus, there is reason to fear a rising military threat from the north. Thousands of Russian servicemen, equipment and aircrafts are flooding into Belarus, accompanied by increasingly bellicose rhetoric from Russian and Belarusian leadership. I would not be surprised to hear that this has nothing to do with Ukraine, that they are performing drills in their own countries and so on. The fact is that we have been played this before. And as we know now, every time there has been a Russian denial regarding Ukraine, the exact opposite has happened. Mr. President, last week, after the Council was blocked in a pattern we are all familiar with, the UNGA voted to overwhelmingly condemn the latest Russian annexation of parts of the territory of Ukraine. The world response was clear and resounding, and Russia was again alone, immured in denial. Albania does not recognize any of the Russian actions. They have no legitimacy, no legal effect. They are null and void, and Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia are and will remain Ukrainian territories. This war must end, and we call on Russia to put an end to it by respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine in its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for that statement. I will now make a declaration in my capacity as a representative of Gabon. I thank Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and the Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator Denise Brown for their briefings. Dear colleagues, the war in Ukraine continues. It is increasingly brutal and deadly, and the humanitarian situation is worsening constantly. Civilians and civilian infrastructure continue to be the target of attacks, shelling, and this is having grave repercussions on electricity supply, water supply, and telecommunications. The use of remote weapons adds to the climate of terror. I will here halt my inventory of damage and distress to say once again that it is time for this Council to mobilize to put an end to this war. It is time for our debates, our language, and our action to focus on solving the Ukraine crisis. That has been Gabon's constant appeal since the very beginning of the crisis. We have spent almost 8 months counting the death numbers and numbers of war refugees. We have, during these 8 months, made each of our meetings a moment at which we hurled insults regarding causes, protests, devastations. We've listed responsibilities, talked about the current, imminent, and potential consequences of the conflict. But that hasn't in any way served to mitigate the scope of devastation seen on the ground. Today, we are still at the stage of taking inventory of fears, of atrocities, and of humanitarian distress. And we're doing that in a one side against the other paradigm. And that leaves every nation of the world with no option but to side with either one camp or the other. Dear colleagues, it is time to find a solution which will see the weapons in Ukraine fall silent. Silencing the weapons is no doubt the aspiration of any and all peoples gripped by insecurity that war brings with it. Silencing the guns is first and foremost the vocation of this organization. We call upon the parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law and the resolutions of this council, namely Resolution 2231, and to allow unfettered humanitarian access. With winter round the corner, we call for a humanitarian truce and for the opening of new humanitarian corridors in order to preserve access to drinking water, electricity, heating, medical treatment, and to facilitate the distribution of humanitarian aid that the disaster-stricken people so desperately need. Dear colleagues, there is a time for everything, a time for antagonism, a time for dialogue, and we think that the time has come to silence the weapons. The time has come to give dialogue a chance. My country calls upon the parties to commit to negotiations in good faith to put an end to this deadly war and to achieve peaceful coexistence in the region. Thank you.
I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I'm happy that months, if not years, of our efforts to remove Russia from the Security Council bring fruits, and now at least the ambassador is removed from the Council. The day will come and Russia will be removed from the Council altogether. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Under Secretary General DiCarlo, and Ms. Brown, Resident Coordinator. I regret the Security Council is still compelled to listen to this representative who just fled. The only thing he has done over almost 8 months of invasion is pile lies upon lies at every meeting about every aspect of the war of aggression his master ordered in February. Let me remind you of what this person said at the Security Council meetings at the beginning of this invasion. And I will quote very carefully. The Russian military poses no threat to Ukraine's peaceful citizens. The military does not fire at peaceful civilian infrastructure, the flag ambassador said on the 27th February. Let me offer you another quote from this person. I quote, "We repeat again that the goal of Russia's special military operation is not to occupy Ukraine or to harm the local population. Russia's special operation does not impact critical civilian infrastructure," said the ambassador who just left on the 28th of February in this very chamber. I wonder whether Putin's representative is ready to repeat these statements now. Apparently not, because he's not physically present. Against the backdrop of mass graves and tens of thousands of Ukrainians killed and tortured by Russians. Against the backdrop of the attempted illegal annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions by the Russian Federation, which the UN General Assembly rejected last Wednesday by an overwhelming majority. And finally, against the backdrop of recent deliberate attacks against Ukrainian critical energy infrastructure. Mr. President, in the wake of deliberate attacks by Russia since the 24th of February, Ukrainian law enforcement agencies have registered the damage or destruction of 51,412 civilian infrastructure facilities. Since October the 10th, there have been about 300 missile and drone attacks by Russia targeting energy facilities and other civilian infrastructure in 14 regions, including the capital city. As a result of these attacks, at least 17 civilians have been killed and 99 injured. Nearly 40% of Ukraine's energy facilities have been damaged or destroyed. Power plants, central heating plants, transformers, oil storages, distribution devices, overhead power lines, and other energy equipment throughout the country remain under Russian fire almost on a daily basis. Now, let me bring you back to the history of this Council. I would like to remind all in this regard that on the 13th of February 2017, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2341, initiated by Ukraine, on the protection of critical infrastructure against terrorist attacks. The resolution called upon all member states to ensure that they have established criminal responsibility for terrorist attacks intended to destroy or disable critical infrastructure, as well as the planning of, training for, and financing of, and logistical support for such attacks. Even Russia joined consensus on that day. Even more worth recalling that Russia claimed at that meeting, and I quote again, "It is not worthwhile to start negotiations that seek merely to outline obvious points," end of quote. Obvious for Russia, indeed. Can the Russian representative state it again? Apparently not. For the record, that it is obvious that the destruction and disabling of critical infrastructure should be regarded as terrorist attacks that entail criminal responsibility. Every part of the criminal regime in Moscow is soaked with blood and permeated by crime. It is not surprising, therefore, that Putin has chosen as a new commander of his army in Ukraine a person who is infamous for his both bloodthirsty and criminal nature. In 1991, during the coup d'etat attempt launched by Soviet hardliners, this person, his name is Surovikin, ordered his military unit to drive through barricades erected by pro-democracy protesters in the streets of Moscow. 3 of them were killed, and Surovikin spent half a year in a pretrial center under investigation. 7 years later, he was convicted of legal possession and trafficking of firearms and given a 1-year suspended sentence. As a commander of Russian forces in Syria, Surovikin was responsible for unconstrained bombing and attacks on civilian targets, including schools and hospitals. Now, in an attempt to live up to the expectations of his masterminds, he transfers the practice of making no differentiation between soldiers and civilians to Ukrainian soil. Mr. President, we have information that Russia is deliberately preparing the ground for a large-scale disaster in the south of Ukraine. Russian terrorists have mined the dam and aggregates of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant, one of the largest power facilities in Ukraine. The dam of this power plant holds about 18 million cubic meters of water. If Russian terrorists blow up this dam, more than 80 settlements, including Kherson, with hundreds of thousands of people living there, will be in an area of rapid flooding. The water supply at a large part of the south of Ukraine may be distorted. These Russian terrorist attacks could leave the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant without water for cooling, as this water is taken from the Kakhovka reservoir. The Russian representative may call this information, I quote his own words, speculations and unfounded accusations, triggered, I quote him again, a wish to generate hysteria. We heard these words from the same person at the Security Council meeting on the 31st of January, accusing those who expressed concerns over Russian military preparations on Ukrainian borders of, I quote, whipping up hysteria, and claiming that, I quote, discussion about the threat of war is provocative and Yes, it's provocative in and of itself. He tried to mock the information about planned military action that, I quote, is going to take place in just a few weeks' time. We all know what happened in a few weeks' time then. And now it is necessary to act immediately so that Russia does not have the chance to commit another act of terror. An international observation mission to the Kakhovka power plant is needed. It is also necessary to return the Ukrainian personnel there and ensure immediate and professional demining of the aggregates and the dam itself. We are concerned over the announced by the Russian occupiers so-called evacuation of residents of temporarily occupied Kherson region. The consequences of such an evacuation may be unpredictable because it is about forced deportation of citizens of Ukraine. And every time the Russian fakes and propaganda have been refuted by credible and independent sources. We all remember Russian attempts to avoid responsibility for the Bucha massacre, attempts that failed almost immediately due to the numerous eyewitness accounts, findings, and investigations. The most recent contribution to revealing the truth about Russian war crimes and crimes against humanity was made by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, established by the UN Human Rights Council. Mr. President, our memories about convulsions of the Russian delegation in the General Assembly on Monday, October the 10th, are still fresh. We have just witnessed how the Russian delegation desperately tries to prevent the UN from allegations of gross violations of a Security Council resolution. We are extremely concerned over the use of long-range UAVs of Iranian origin by Russia in its indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. This represents a blatant violation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action signed by China, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, the European Union, and Russia itself, and then adopted by the UN Security Council Resolution 2231. As you are aware, according to the Annex B to that resolution, the prohibitions were imposed on the supply, sale, or transfer to or from Iran. This September, the UAVs marked as Geran 2 were captured by the Forces of Defense of Ukraine, and after technical examination, they appear to be similar to Iranian UAVs Shahed 136, which are capable of delivering payload to the range exceeding 300 kilometers and fully correspond to the technical parameters set in the document S/2015/546. As you are also aware, on October 15, 2022, Ukraine officially addressed the UN Security Council Chair on these violations and requested to start the relevant investigations. However, there is even more worrying information about strong intentions of Russia to continue further attacks on Ukraine with the advanced Iranian missile and UAV systems, including ballistic missiles Fateh 110 and Zolfaghar, capable of striking targets of the range of 300 and 700 kilometers, respectively. This will bring more deaths and destruction to Ukraine, and this will represent another gross violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which calls on Iran not to undertake any activity related to ballistic missiles designed to be capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Another important element that has to be thoroughly examined is related to the possible export by Russia to Iran of dual-use services, including technical assistance or technical information by providing Iran as a regional exporter with the data on the results of UAV's utilization at the battlefield in Ukraine. Iran also has to face serious consequences already now for its illegal actions that help to escalate the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. That is why we call on all states to consider any possible steps to stop this kind of UAVs, missile, or conventional arms transfers from Iran. We fully agree that the UN investigation should start immediately, and we welcome strong support for such steps by many members of the UN Security Council. We have already invited UN experts to visit Ukraine to inspect recovered Iranian-origin UAVs in order to facilitate implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2231. Distinguished colleagues, Ukraine remains committed to the implementation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Since its launch, 362 vessels with 8 million tons of food products on board left Ukrainian ports for the countries of Asia, Europe, and Africa. Ukraine continues working with the UN World Food Programme to increase the amount of food sent to the most vulnerable countries. In particular, on the 18th of October, the sixth bulk carrier under this program arrived in the port of Chornomorsk to be further sent to Yemen. The export of Ukrainian grain has already contributed to the stabilization of the global market, a decrease in prices, and a reduction in chaos caused by lack of food around the world. We therefore support its extension after the 22nd November, when the initial 120-day period will expire. Mr. President, terrorist attacks by Russia against Ukraine only mobilize the international community to support Ukraine even more and put even stronger pressure on the terrorist state. Each of the terrorists and war criminals, including war crimes suspects in this very chamber, will be held accountable sooner or later, and the terrorist state will pay for its terror, pay with isolation, degradation, and assets, both of state and quasi-private entities connected with this Russian regime. But the world must react preventively in order not to let Kakhovka or other disaster happen. As President Zelensky said yesterday in his address to the nation, the principle of preventive response to security threats should finally become one of the basic principles of international politics. And I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovakia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Slovakia strongly condemns the ongoing Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military aggression against Ukraine. It is a clear sign of a strong violation of the UN Charter, international law, and the rules based on international order. Thank you for convening this meeting. It's important to continue focusing on the situation in Ukraine. The fact that this Council has so far failed to take decisive action on the crisis, on the war, should not stop us from focusing enough on what is going on. And in that context, I would like to thank and appreciate USG DiCarlo and Resident Coordinator Brown and their informative and important briefings. We remain also as a neighboring country of Ukraine gravely concerned about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which is today the focus of our discussion, and rightly so, because if there is one thing that should never slip from our attention, it is the people who are suffering this senseless war and who need to be heard and whose situation needs to be addressed. Unfortunately, it progressively further deteriorates, as we have heard, and this should not go unnoticed. Older persons, persons with disabilities, and other persons belonging to marginalized groups and minorities are affected also by the consequences of this war, facing a big trauma and are even more likely to be exposed as victims due to the higher risk of devastating violation of their rights. We remain appalled by the huge numbers of killings of innocent civilians, attacks on critical infrastructure, as well as the huge scale of sexual and gender-based violence committed by Russian soldiers and occupants. Thousands of people killed, hundreds of schools destroyed or damaged, having negative impact on children whose fundamental right to education has been breached, as well as attacks on medical facilities, are only a short list of consequences this madness caused due to Putin's senseless decision to begin the war. But the Russian Federation obviously does not understand the phrase "enough is enough," which was already opined by the Secretary General. We have witnessed in latest days another slew of variety of missiles and Iranian drones attacks to target cities in Ukraine, including Kiev, Dnipro, Vinnytsia, and Ivano-Frankivsk in central Ukraine, Zaporozhye in the south, and the Kharkiv and Sumy regions in the east, among others. We are particularly concerned about attacks on energy infrastructure, having impact on people's access to water and heat, which is particularly disturbing with regard to coming winter. We are deeply concerned about the serious effects of the Russian invasion on global food security. As we know, millions of people around the world are being pushed into extreme poverty, hunger, and lack of access to food. And in that context, we, of course, fully support the extension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative and safe passage of agricultural delivery and shipping from Ukrainian ports, and we hope that this will be done. No one, unfortunately, can predict when this senseless war will end, and we want it to be as soon as possible. But those who believe that by reaching a truce, silencing the guns, everything would be over are wrong. Perpetrators of such heinous attacks like those in Bucha, Kramatorsk, or quite recently in Izium cannot remain unpunished, must and will be brought to justice. Slovakia recognizes Ukraine as an independent, sovereign state with unquestionable territorial integrity. All acts associated with the forcible acquisition of Ukrainian territory by the Russian Federation are null, void, and illegitimate. The so-called referenda in the occupied regions took place during an active armed conflict in areas under Russian occupation and cannot be called a true expression of the will of the people. Slovakia will never recognize these territories as anything but a part of Ukraine. The voice of the United Nations from last week was crystal clear. We have received a lot of questions from our citizens, from the media, from young people, and the message needs to remain clear. Therefore, we urge the Russian Federation to fully implement the United Nations General Assembly resolution of 12 of October without further delay. This is the least that we can do for the people of Ukraine, for those suffering, and for the future of our planet. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Slovakia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Mr. President, I thank you, and I also thank Undersecretary General DiCarlo and Resident Coordinator Denise Brown for their briefings. Yet again, they have made clear the horrific consequences Russia's ongoing aggression has for the people of Ukraine and around the world. The world remains united for peace. 143 countries have once again condemned Russia's action, demanded Russia to respect the Charter, and to end its war immediately and unconditionally. Russia's reaction to the world's call for peace is shocking. Over these last days, it has escalated its attacks, deliberately and systematically targeting civilian infrastructure. Hundreds of missiles and drones, including drones supplied by Iran, have been hitting playgrounds, residential buildings, schools, hospitals, bridges, and power stations. Russia's aim is clear. The Moscow regime wants to subjugate Ukraine. It wants to plunge Ukraine, quite literally, into darkness and make Ukrainians freeze, knocking out electricity and heating for millions of civilians. These attacks violate international humanitarian law and could amount to war crimes. Those responsible for these blatant violations of international law will be held accountable. Let me join colleagues in pointing out that Russia is also violating Resolution 2231. Yet another example of how Russia, as permanent member of this Council, fails the UN Charter. All information we have is quite clear. The Iranian drones are being used to terrorize civilians and have been delivered to Russia without prior approval by this Council and therefore in blatant violation of Resolution 2231. We are concerned, and very much concerned, by reports that Iran also intends to deliver ballistic missiles to Russia. We would welcome an investigation by the UN team responsible for monitoring the implementation of 2231 and stand ready to support their technical and impartial efforts. Mr. President, Germany will continue to stand by the UN Charter wherever in the world it is breached, and we will continue to stand by Ukraine. We stand ready to support Ukraine in mitigating the devastation caused by Russia's attacks. This coming Tuesday, Chancellor Scholz and President von der Leyen will host the International Expert Conference on the Recovery, Reconstruction and Modernization of Ukraine in Berlin. This conference will galvanize international support for Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. To conclude, Mr. President, the Russian Federation must change its course, fully respect the letter and spirit of the UN Charter, and withdraw from Ukraine. It must comply with the legally binding order of the International Court of Justice to immediately stop its military operations against Ukraine and withdraw. Germany will continue to uphold the territorial integrity and political independence of Ukraine within its international recognized borders, and this is the duty of each and every one of us. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Monsieur le Président, Excellencies, at the outset, I thank you, Mr. President, for convening this important briefing, and also thank today's briefers for their valuable statements. Poland supports the written statement presented for today's debate by Lithuania on behalf of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Czech Republic. The main reason why we meet today again in this chamber is Russia's deliberate strategy to create a humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine by pursuing its brutal war. And this war is regrettably far from being over. The recent Kremlin decision on military mobilization and illegal annexations of Ukrainian territories, coupled with nuclear rhetoric and mass airstrikes against civilian infrastructure, indicates that Russia has chosen the path of escalation. It has dramatic consequences not only in Ukraine, but also for global security and economic stability, including the dire situation on energy markets, and as well as the cost of living crisis. Fierce Russian air attacks against civilian targets launched on October 10th and following days, and continued since then, are yet another violation of international law. They seem to have the two purposes. Moscow wants to intimidate the civilian population and to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which is critical, especially in the winter period. That's why the issue we need to focus on immediately is the perspective of upcoming winter. Due to the Russian bombings, over 3.5 million people are left without a roof over their head. Mr. President, another immediate aspect to the everyday life of people that we do not discuss that often are the presence of the explosive deliberately left behind by the Russians. Those the challenge ahead of us in demining of the areas, including agricultural lands, in various regions of Ukraine. The mines and unexploded ordnance are a threat to civilians, including children. There is an urgent need to provide adequate equipment to conduct these operations efficiently and quickly. Mr. President, we condemned in the strongest possible terms recent missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. Shelling civilians is a war crime. Civilians are not a target.
Civilians are protected by international law, including Geneva Conventions. Civilians must not be taken hostages. Russian Federation has shown the total lack of respect for the international humanitarian law and human rights law. Its forces have committed horrific atrocities. Poland will continue to work with international institutions and Ukraine to ensure that those responsible for these barbaric acts are held accountable. Poland has consistently supported Ukraine and its citizens in the fight against the aggressor. Poland became a new home for over 1.3 million refugees who enjoy the same access to public services and social security benefits as Polish citizens. We also help those who stayed to fight for their country and cannot leave by providing government's humanitarian aid. The only appropriate response to Russian attacks is to increase the scale of our support for Ukraine. In that context, let me express Polish support for brave and valuable work of the UN team in Ukraine. Mr. President, I would like to emphasize that the whole tragedy that this enormous humanitarian crisis is purely man-made. There are no elements to blame. It is Russia who started the aggression, and only Russia bears the full responsibility for all the destructions and loss of life it has caused. The only way out is peace. And for peace to come, we need Russian troops to be out of Ukraine. In its recent resolution, UN General Assembly demanded Russia to reverse course of attempted illegal annexation. 143 member states strongly reaffirmed Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in its internationally recognized borders. This confirms without any doubt that no territorial concessions are expected from Ukraine for peace to occur. Despite this clear decision, Russia continues its path of escalation acts against peace in Ukraine. Mr. President, Poland appeals to the members of this Council and the whole international community to increase pressure on Russia to stop this war. That would be an immediate, almost overnight solution to the whole crisis. Russia must immediately stop the aggression, withdraw its troops, and abide to the rules of the UN Charter that equally applies to all. That will enable us all to start peace building and to restore the shattered lives and livelihoods of Ukrainian people. And we are ready to do so. Give peace a chance. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olaf Skog, head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Thank you for convening us. Thank you for highlighting and organizing this meeting. It's very important that it be discussed, and it's very important that all concerned are able to address the Council on such an important issue. Mr. President, 2 days ago, the European Parliament awarded the 2022 Sakharov Prize to the people of Ukraine. For a people who are safeguarding the values of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, a people who have been forced to flee, and people who have sadly lost relatives and friends. There can be no more deserving people of that kind of a recognition. Mr. President, we are appalled by Russia's intensification of bombardments on civilians and civilian facilities, which constitute serious violations of international humanitarian law. This and last week's air attacks deliberately targets critical infrastructure and terrorize civilians in Kiev and other Ukrainian cities. Targeting civilians, schools, and energy supplies can never be legitimate. Almost a third of Ukraine's power stations have been disabled. Russia must be held accountable for these evident violations of international humanitarian law that are resulting in hundreds of civilian casualties every week. The same goes for those who facilitate the aggression, Belarus and Iran. We strongly condemn the clandestine transfer of combat drones by Iran to Russia without seeking the Security Council's prior approval, which constitutes a material breach of Security Council Resolution 2231. The damage to Ukraine's energy infrastructure is creating major challenges in view of the upcoming winter and will require stepping up the international humanitarian response. During his visit in Kiev this week, EU Commissioner Lenarčič announced the mobilization of an additional 175 million euros in humanitarian funding to address urgent needs and provide education, food, access to water, and protection from the cold winter. However, no level of humanitarian funding will be enough if Russian attacks continue to target energy infrastructure and heating stations. More than 400 of these have been damaged in the past 2 weeks alone. The Russian Federation must immediately stop its attacks, suspend its military operations in the territory of Ukraine, and withdraw all its military forces, armed groups, and other unauthorized personnel from the territory of Ukraine, as has been set out by General Assembly. We know that humanitarian needs in Ukraine are immense and growing, yet we cannot even assess their scale in the non-government controlled areas. On Wednesday, we heard a plea from the UN resident coordinator. Access must be given to humanitarian organizations immediately so that they can assist all vulnerable people in Ukraine without distinction. This is not about politics, it is a humanitarian imperative. We are devastated by the repeated discoveries of atrocities in liberated areas and the increasing horrific number of civilian casualties across the country. Where the Russian armed forces have been, minefields are left behind, making delivery of humanitarian assistance impossible and endangering the lives of innocent people. Shocking are reports of arbitrary executions and detentions, rape, torture, and other ill treatment, unlawful forcible transfers, and deportations of Ukrainian civilians, including children, within territories under Russian military control to Russia. We note that the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine concluded, based on the evidence gathered in the regions of Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy, that atrocities to be classified as war crimes have been committed in Ukraine. We stress the importance of collecting, consolidating, and analyzing evidence of violations and abuses of human rights and violations of IHL and related crimes committed in the context of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and we support measures to ensure accountability, including the investigations by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. We also underline that all international and regional accountability and monitoring mechanisms should be granted full, secure, and unrestricted access to the entire territory of Ukraine, including to all war-related detainees. We therefore urge the Russian Federation to comply with the appeal of the Secretary General to grant the International Committee of the Red Cross full access to all prisoners of war. The release of over 100 Ukrainian women, which took place on 17th of October, is an important step in the right direction. Mr. President, Russia's unprovoked, unjustified, and illegal war of aggression against Ukraine has created a humanitarian crisis that is also having devastating global impacts. The deliberate destruction by Russia of Ukraine's agricultural and transport infrastructure is causing worldwide food supply chain disruptions and endangers the food security of millions of people around the globe. In this context, the Black Sea Grain Initiative is of key importance to mitigate the global impact of Russia's aggression, and we support the call by the Secretary General Antonio Guterres to extend it beyond November 19. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Skoog for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Minister of Foreign Affairs of Greece, Nikos Dendias, traveled to Kiev on Wednesday under well-known extraordinary circumstances, being the only visit taking place within this troublesome period. Kiev, as the rest of the country, is on a daily basis under vicious attacks resulting in the death and injury of dozens of unarmed innocent people. This is the third visit of Minister Dendias in Ukraine since the beginning of the war, as he has visited Odessa twice, a city connected with Greek history and the Greek community of Ukraine. These visits send a strong message expressing the full solidarity of the Greek government to the government and the people of Ukraine. For centuries, Greeks have been present, especially on the Black Sea shores. In particular, the area of Mariupol has been a home to a century-long established Greek community of around 100,000 people. It is also one of the areas which have been hit the hardest by the Russian forces. The city of Mariupol has been almost entirely destroyed. For Greece, respect for international law, for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all countries is the pillar of our foreign policy. And for that, from day one, we condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Recent horrific attacks carried out by drones are having far-reaching repercussions affecting directly vital civil infrastructure, leading to an inhuman, continuous and merciless shelling targeting innocent lives. Greece condemns these attacks in the strongest of terms. We have repeatedly asked for urgent compliance with international humanitarian law for the protection of civilians and their property, safeguarding the right of safe passage from conflict zones across the valid zones, access to valid information concerning areas of safe temporary shelter, as well as humanitarian access to areas where civilians continue to reside. Greece is providing humanitarian aid from the very start of the war. We have so far delivered multiple packages of needs-based in-kind humanitarian assistance. Furthermore, we are firmly engaged to the reconstruction of Ukraine. We have announced that we are ready to rebuild a maternity hospital destroyed by Russian shelling in the city of Mariupol and to contribute to the reconstruction of Odessa, another city close to heart for us since our struggle for independence began there. And we are ready and working together for the promotion of the candidacy of the Historic Center of Odessa for inscription on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Given my country's particular sensitivity regarding children, we have pledged 100,000 euros to UNICEF's humanitarian action in Ukraine. Furthermore, we have taken over the treatment of children with cancer at the Oncologic Hospital for Children, Elpida, which means hope. Also, we responded effectively to the needs of tens of thousands of Ukrainian citizens seeking refuge from the war, having welcomed more than 75,000 refugees, including unaccompanied minors, unfortunately separated from their families from Ukraine, eligible to immediate protection. A call center has been set up to facilitate communication of displaced persons from Ukraine with detailed information provided in Greek, English, and Ukrainian. Actions on education level have also been into effect to ensure the inclusion of Ukrainian pupils. At the same time, through our commercial fleet, we contribute to the transfer of Ukrainian grain towards key ports in the North African region in an effort to face food crisis. Greece is also strongly committed to accountability for war crimes. Minister Denise has sent relevant letter to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and in this respect visited The Hague. No matter all the efforts of the international community, the only real solution to the ongoing suffering of the Ukrainian people is the immediate cessation of the unprovoked aggression on the part of Russia. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece. There are no more speakers on the speakers list. The meeting is adjourned.